So there's actually a paradox in healing from anxiety. And I do believe that understanding this paradox will help you heal your anxiety faster. And I almost never hear this talked about. But the paradox is that the behaviors that you'll need to engage in to lower your anxiety and the thought patterns that need to be changed in order to lower your anxiety, those things will temporarily increase your anxiety. So, and I know that sounds really difficult, and I'm going to talk about how you can do that and what helps you do that and why. And I also want to give examples of how this applies to specific anxiety disorders and specific situations. So, most anxiety disorders go with either avoidant behaviors or compulsive behaviors. And part of the healing, part of the truly rewiring your brain will be to not avoid those things you avoid and to not engage in the more compulsive activities that might temporarily lower your anxiety but over time increase your anxiety. So engaging in those things you avoid in will make your anxiety temporarily increase, and holding back from those compulsive behaviors. And I'm going to give you examples so you can figure this out. But holding back from those compulsive behaviors will temporarily increase your anxiety. So at the end of today, I'm going to talk about ways to tolerate the increased anxiety that you'll need to tolerate. But let's use some examples to make this clear. So, hopefully, you're familiar with the anxiety cycle that I talk about in a lot of my other videos, but our behaviors and our thought patterns and our feelings are all interconnected, and a change in one of them changes the others. But the most effective ways to change how we feel are through either a change in our thought or a change in our behaviors. So let's talk through some of the anxiety disorders that have avoidant behavior. So, for example, agoraphobia, the person gets to the point where they don't want to leave their apartment, or it might be very crowd focused. They won't go anywhere that they anticipate might have any kind of crowd. Or somebody with social anxiety disorder will avoid going to social events because they will be afraid that they'll do something embarrassing or people won't like them. So they avoid going to social events, or they'll go, but they won't fully engage. They kind of really hold back. So when we engage in those avoidant behaviors tied to our anxieties, we're reinforcing to our old brain, to the old parts of our brain. Yeah, that is really scary, because also when I make the decision to avoid going to that crowded place, avoid going to that social event, I get a temporary relief. Whew, that's really reinforcing to this part of the brain. But long term, it is maintaining that anxiety. So full recovery will require you to engage in those social events or go to a crowded event, because that is the way that you really will be able to rewire those connections between your behaviors, your thoughts, and your feelings. Now, some of the anxiety disorders that have more compulsive behaviors, one could be a health related anxiety where you compulsively research on the internet every possible health problem. And again, that compulsive behavior is giving you a temporary relief. You temporarily feel like you're actually doing something. But because that isn't really what the problem is, right? It isn't a problem that really needs that type of research. It is reinforcing the anxiety, and holding back from that behavior will temporarily increase your anxiety. Now, obsessive compulsive disorder, no longer considered an anxiety disorder, but has a lot of similarities, and these patterns are the same. So, if you have somebody who has a very common OCD problem of hand washing all the time, the actual act of that hand washing temporarily reduces the anxiety of the person with OCD. It's a temporary, like, okay. And then the anxiety rises. They might feel like they need to do it again. They might feel like they need to do it again. each time they do it, there's a mini relief, but it is maintaining the cycle. So to fully recover, they will need to extinguish that behavior, which will temporarily increase anxiety. So I'm going to mention a very different situation, and it was actually the reason I thought to do this video is last week I put out a video on parentification and anxiety. So people who compulsively overdo, take on responsibility for other people, people who worry a lot about other people's emotions and do a lot of emotional caretaking of other people, and it's tied to anxiety because we really can't. We can influence other people's emotions, but we can't fully take care of them. And people who grew up parentified, who grew up doing that, they were sort of taught that they had to take on the impossible. And anxiety is very often related to trying to control the things that we can't control. So in that video, I talk about how to recover from that type of anxiety, one needs to hold back from intervening, from giving advice, from overdoing, from taking on too much, from jumping in to try to solve a problem that another able-bodied adult should be able to solve for themselves, right? And holding back on those behaviors, particularly because they've been so ingrained, they were so ingrained so young, holding back on those behaviors will be temporarily anxiety producing. But it is the change in our actual behaviors that probably has the greatest influence on rewiring our brains. And you will hear a lot of talk about how you have to change your thoughts, change your thoughts, change your thoughts. And yep, eventually, right? Changing our thought patterns and changing our behaviors helps us get out of ruts that we are in, whether it's an anxiety disorder or something else. But it isn't all about the thought. And sometimes we can't change the thought. We need to change the behaviors. And so, just an aside here, I do have a free webinar if you haven't seen it called Rewire Your Brain for Joy and Confidence. And I go through some really interesting scientific research on what happens in the brain when you do certain behaviors and how changing some of those things can help you focus more on joy, reorient your brain away from anxiety towards the present moment, towards things that bring you joy and pleasure in the moment. So check that out. I think you'll find it helpful. Okay, so let's also talk about some of the behaviors that help lower anxiety in the long term. Some of those behaviors might temporarily increase your anxiety also. So it's not just not avoiding or holding back on the compulsive things. It's not just getting rid of the behaviors that come from your anxiety, right? It can also be that implementing some of the newer behaviors can make you feel anxious. And a great example of that is meditation. So I hear from a lot of people who have anxiety, I can't meditate. It makes me more anxious. And yes, if you have a lot of anxiety and you try to sit still for 10 minutes and do nothing, focus only on your breathing, right? Particularly if you're doing this without a guided meditation, you might feel a lot of anxiety. In fact, so much that it might just be hard to stay sitting, right? But understanding that the cure in the long run is to be able to tolerate that anxiety, is to be able to slow things down. And meditation has definitely been shown long term to help lower anxiety. Another thing that helps lower anxiety is to accept powerlessness when we are powerless. And I mentioned this in the video I did last week about the parentification, but a lot of people feel like if I accept my powerlessness, if I accept that I really can't change this situation, it will make me more anxious and maybe temporarily. But overall, if you really are powerless over somebody else's behavior, somebody else's addiction, somebody else's emotions, or powerless to actually achieve a certain outcome that you really would like, admitting that powerlessness will be a huge relief and it will help you focus on what you can do now that can create the best outcome, even if you can't control the outcome, the final outcome. And most of us, for the big items in life, we can't control that final outcome, but we can focus on what puts us in the best position to get there. And that is way more productive, and doing something productive will lower your anxiety. Really curious what you think to this point. I am about to talk about ways to tolerate that increased anxiety, but comment below. Let me know what you think to this point. Is this making sense? Is it helpful? Not? Love to hear from you. All right. So, how do you tolerate this increased anxiety? One suggestion is to learn to sit with the discomfort and to investigate it. What does it feel like? Where do you feel it in your body? Really think through what you are physically feeling when you feel anxious, where you feel it. People feel it in different places. Some feel it in their stomachs, some in their muscles, their tension, their heart rate, different places to feel it. And then when you're thinking about where you feel it, what is it you're feeling? What are the qualities of the feeling? So really delve into what it feels like with curiosity. And as you're doing that, you can also breathe into it. Breathe diaphragmatically, slowly, even inhale to an even exhale. Nice, slow, even diaphragmatic breath, because that breathing will also tell this part of your brain that you're safe enough, basically, and will help you lower the anxiety while you're thinking about it and while you're tolerating it. Again, that's sort of a paradox, but if you try it, I think you'll understand what I mean. And if you're practicing either engaging in those behaviors that you usually avoid or holding back from the compulsive behaviors, investigate what that feels like to do it. Let yourself feel it. I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's extremely uncomfortable, but you can tolerate it. Some people talk about, invite your anxiety in for tea. And that can be a very helpful concept for some people. But sometimes we don't really want to invite them in for tea. We don't really want to be too friendly with them. But bring an air of curiosity to that feeling. Now, a number of different psychotherapy techniques really help you sit with the feeling of anxiety, and those would include somatic based therapy techniques. It also includes something called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, quite a mouthful, but I find EMDR super helpful. And then exposure therapy, which is very effective if people can stick with it, particularly for phobias or OCD or social anxiety or health anxiety. So, some type of exposure focus in the treatment that's done in a way where it's bit by bit, a little bit by a little bit, not all of a sudden, which might be too much to handle. And a way to do that for yourself, or if you're working with a therapist, is to imagine tolerating the anxiety. Imagine going into the crowd. Imagine going to the social event, giving a speech, not paying attention to an internal ache or pain. Imagine doing that. Imagine what that increased anxiety will feel like and tolerate it. So, really feel it, tolerate it, breathe into it, and imagining ourselves doing things that we know we can do, right? But we feel too anxious to do can really help. All right, let me know what you thought of this. I also want to mention I don't do therapy anymore. So I do have a couple of resources. I'll put them in the description. I'm an affiliate of two different online therapy sites. And there's also a online program called Virtual EMDR, which guides you through a self-help process for EMDR. So I'll show a picture of that here, and I'll put the link in the description to the video as well. I hope those tools help, and let me know what you think of this paradox.